Hello, everyone who's joining us so far. We're going to start this event in about 3 minutes just to let people join. Thank you to everyone who's already joined now. To start us off, it would be nice if you shared in the chat where you're joining us from. I'm sitting in downtown Vancouver in the West End. It's a lovely sunny day. So if you can share with us in the chat where you're joining from, that would be wonderful. Montreal, Canada, amazing. From Montreal, from Toronto, Salt Spring Island, Wasaga Beach. Wow, amazing. So one quick note from folks who are joining and sharing on the chat right now. I see that most people are sharing only to the panelists. And so I'm going to ask you a quick favor. I'm actually going to turn my video on so I'm not just some random voice on the internet. So thank you all for sharing where you're joining us from. That's wonderful. So quick note about the chat. By default, unfortunately, Zoom makes it so that you can only send messages to the panelists. So only myself and the people in the background are seeing this. But if you want to share where you're joining us from so that everyone can see, please change the setting to panelists and attendees. And that'll be great for the rest of the webinar so that we can all see your comments and your questions. So I'll explain very quickly how we're going to do that. There's a blue button right above where it says type message here on the chat. There's a blue button. It should say panelists only by default. So if you click on that blue button, it'll open up options and you'll be able to choose panelists and attendees. So please take a second right now to switch that to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you comment and we can all be part of your conversation. So Calgary, West Vancouver, Burnaby, Vancouver, Victoria, BC, Burnaby, Toronto, Victoria, Burnaby, Yaletown, Sackville, New Brunswick. Wow. Thanks for joining us from afar. The unceded Coast Salish territories near Granville Island, Dunbar. It's incredible that all of you are joining from so many places. Very exciting. So I'm going to start in about 30 seconds. There's still people trickling in. We have a lot of participants today, so it's very exciting. Thank you all for joining us for this lunchtime event. I know it's a sunny day in Vancouver and probably some of you want to take your lunch outside, so thank you for the sacrifice of being here today. Okay, so we're going to get this started now. And give me 1 second. Trying to find my script here. Wonderful. Okay, so hola, buenas tardes. Hello everyone and welcome. Mucho gusto. My name is Jorge Amigo and I'm the head of cultural programming for the Vancouver Public Library. I'm going to be your host for today. Now my colleague Jen is also working on this event and they will be in the background making sure that everything is running smoothly. So please say hi to Jen in the chat. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to encourage all of you to read and understand the history of this land and the people who have taken care of it for thousands of years, and what it means for you to be here. Now, if you're joining us from another part of the world or another part of the country, there's a great resource that Jen is going to share in the chat so you can learn about the land where you live. Now, as I was saying, quick note about the chat settings. Because we're not gathering in the same place right now, unfortunately, the way to make this a warm environment online is for us to be able to read what you say. So please take a second to change your chat settings. There's a blue button. It should be set to panelists and attendees. That way we can all read what you're saying. If you stick it to only panelists, only the panelists can see what you're talking about. So take a second to change that in the chat, please. Now, I am very thrilled to be here today because this is the very first event of a series of 5 events exploring issues of identity and belonging for Latin Americans. This series is called Racisms, Latin America and Identity, and it's a collaboration between the library and the Vancouver Latin American Cultural Center, or VLACC. So I'm excited to introduce Lily Vieira de Carvalho, who is the Executive Director of VLACC, who will tell you more about the series and introduce today's speaker. So Lily, please join me on stage and I will leave. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you, Jorge. Yeah. And thank you for the warm introduction. Hello, everyone. Boa tarde, buenas tardes, and thank you for joining us on this first event of the series. So great to see you coming from everywhere around the province, the country, and even from Latin America and the US. I couldn't be more excited about this lineup of 5 events exploring Latin American identity, and we hope to have you again in the upcoming programs through May 21st, which is Friday next week. VLACC is a nonprofit organization with a mandate to share a deeper understanding of Latin American arts and cultures. Our goal is to establish the first cultural center for Latin American arts in Canada, right here in Vancouver. If you would like to know more about VLACC, please visit our website, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter. Jen is going to add the link to our website on the chat. We are very thankful for this partnership with the VPL. I would also like to thank the funders of this event, the government of British Columbia and Canadian Heritage. And naturally, VLACC's staff and volunteers who work very hard to bring this series to you. A shout out to these amazing people. Today's event is being captured in graphic recording by Adriana Contreras. The drawings will be available on VLACC social media channels in a few days. To see more of Adriana's work, you can follow her on Instagram, and that's also a link on the chat. Also, the video recording of this event will be captioned after today. So in a few days, it will be available on VLACC's YouTube channel. You can reach that channel just by going to our website, and there is a little link to YouTube there. So if you want to share this event with someone, that would be a good way to do so, just sharing the YouTube channel. We are also live on Facebook right now, so shout out to the people on Facebook. On today's event, we will have 2 speakers who are experts in their field. I would like to invite to join me on stage, Kasari Govender and Silvio Albuquerque. Hello, Kasari and Silvio. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So Kasari Govender took office as BC's first independent human rights commissioner in 2019. Her role is to lead the promotion and protection of human rights in British Columbia through the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. Kasari has devoted her life to promoting human rights. She earned her law degree from the University of Victoria and her master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Oxford in the UK. She has taught as an Adjunct Professor of Law at UBC and as an instructor at Simon Fraser University. Silvio José Albuquerque Silva is a member of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That's a group of only 18 people worldwide in this UN committee. And Silvio has also held high-level positions in the Brazilian bureaucracy, such as Deputy Secretary of State for Human Rights and Chief of Staff of the Supreme Court's President and of the Minister of Defense. A career diplomat since 1987, besides Canada, where he is the current Consul General of Brazil in Vancouver. He has served in Belgium, Colombia, the United States, and Chile. He holds a master's in international politics from the Free University of Brussels. I am a Brazilian as well, and today Brazilian is commemorating the 133 years of abolition of slavery. So it feels especially meaningful to us that we are starting this event on May 13th. The format today will be simple. Each of them will give a presentation, and then at the end, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. So as you listen to this event, if you have a great question that you want to share, just please use the Q&A button to add your question there, or you can also share it in the chat. If you are on Facebook, just post your questions there, and we'll have someone who will make sure that we get the questions. Thank you both so much for being here, and we'll get started with Silvio's presentation. Thank you. Obrigada.
Thank you, very much, Lily. I want to recognize the presence of a dear friend of mine, Lily Carvalho, and through her, I thank VLACC for this initiative, and also Vancouver Public Library for co-organizing this timely and very important event. It's a pleasure to be here, accompanied by Kasari Govender, BC Human Rights Commissioner. And my idea is to speak briefly about Latin America, but take into account, all of you, that I'm a Brazilian. So some perspective that is going to be offered by me on Latin America is a perspective that is seen from Brazilian eyes. So to simplify things, let us agree that Latin America is a portion of the American continent that comprises 21 independent countries located between Rio Grande and Tierra del Fuego in the southern part of South America. Some authors include a number of Caribbean islands legally considered as overseas collectivity of France or overseas departments of France as part of Latin America. So in this portion of the American continent, we comprise approximately 600 million people. Let's talk about Latin America and Latin Americans. For many decades, and I would say more than a century, the concept of Latin America and the Latin American identity in the West, Canada necessarily included, has been marked by mistaken and even biased definitions. What makes us Latin Americans is the first question that I ask. I'll try to answer to it, but obviously I want to establish a dialogue with you. Being Catholic, not necessarily speaking Spanish, this applies to a significant part of us, but linguistically speaking, we are very rich. We also speak Portuguese and French, but besides, few people are acquainted with the fact that Latin America is one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. There are currently approximately 60 family languages or language families in our region, and about 80 languages spoken by isolated indigenous peoples in our part of the Americas. Many here in BC and in Canada, and I lived in Brussels and also in Washington, DC. Many people in the West associate us to our passion for football, music, dance, and carnival. For most of us, I would say this may be true, not to my wife, but speaking of football, but it is also a superficial way of defining us as Latin American. So the question that I constantly raise is how to go beyond the usual cliches about coffee, carnival, lust, wrongly associated to our women, and football or soccer. How to understand a contradictory society seen by many as a synthesis of harmony, joie de vivre, and violence. One of the greatest traces of Latin America, in my personal point of view, is our cultural richness and extraordinary diversity, which often escapes the opposite sides of the coin, inventing and reinventing practices that distinguish us and includes us in the world. In my view, the brute fact of ancestry does not suffice to make anyone a Latin America or Latino, expression that I tend to use when I speak in Spanish or Portuguese with my friends from Latin America, but I resist to use when I'm speaking in English or French, Latino. Well, it is especially so in the case of second and third generation of Latin Americans living in Canada. If he, she, or they come to identify themselves as Latino-Americano or Latino-Americana and to be accepted by others as such, the special opportunities he, she, or they might be offered would serve the noble function of having people of Latin American identity in a range of positions in the Canadian society, what you don't see nowadays. Well, in the last 40 years, I spoke about it with Lily, and some weeks ago, Kasari was also part of this conversation, informal conversation. I see that in the last 40 years, at least, our vibrant civil society helped to bring important social, cultural, and political changes to many of our countries. In a way, I see it reflected in British Columbia since I arrived here almost 4 years ago, and the cultural and artistic activities linked to Latin America brought up to the local audience by respected institutions led by creative and dynamic people as Lily Carvalho and others. So speaking now of British Columbia, how do British Columbians perceive us? In my view, many answers to these questions are possible. Well, my greatest expectation today is to help defog people's vision of Latin Americans, giving them, all of you, taking part of this dialogue, a clearer window into what can sometimes be a blurry experience, actually in any attempt to understand a human collectivity. In BC, according to official data that I gathered this day, 2.4% of the population speaks Spanish. Under the category entitled, and I quote, population by visible minority group and medium age, Latin Americans corresponded to 1% of the population, comprising approximately 45,000 people with a medium age of 35.7 years old. Clearly, we are not perfectly reflected in official statistics. I'm sure about it. Let me briefly speak to you about this very Canadian expression to classify part of its population. I believe, and I share it with many colleagues of mine at CERD, and this is official position by CERD, our committee at the UN, that it is a mistake, the use by the government of Canada of a category entitled visible minority to label part of the country's population. And why is it so? Because it is an expression that encompasses race, ethnicity, and national origin, which perpetuates discrimination by lumping together diverse groups of people with diverse historic collective experience. That's what we are saying to the government of Canada in the dialogue with our committee along the last years. Speaking specifically of Latin Americans, it is a mistake to see us only based on the visible or invisible characteristics that unite us. We should be seen in our individual and collective differences, which are many, as well as in our contribution that we make to British Columbian society in fields as diverse as information technology, arts, music, medicine, law, social sciences, and many others. So we are many. This is my message, and the way I want to go through this dialogue with you. We are many, diverse, and rich in our contribution to the construction of a unifying history of British Columbia. I wanted to offer a very realistic view of the presence of Latin American women in BC, but because I'm convinced that there are many high-achieving Latin American women out there in all fields, from law to science and arts. Nevertheless, prejudice does impact Latin American women's access to certain jobs in BC and in Canada. This is an impression that I have, but I wanted to prove it with concrete statistics. but unfortunately, I was unable to gather information in our province. I'm speaking of BC, concerning the presence of Latin American women in the labor market due to a lack of data, disaggregated, refined in a way that includes more than one aspect or characteristic, given the impact of what we call in my committee as intersectionality on socioeconomic development. And this is something that I know that is under cautious consideration here in BC. And that's why I strongly commend Kasari and her team for the studies conductive to the development of a policy initiative for the collection of race-based, indigenous, and other disaggregated data to address systemic racism. I believe she's going to talk to us about the so-called the Grandmother Perspective Initiative that is going to be a strong instrument for precise diagnostics of how deep has systemic racism penetrated in BC's institution. And above all, it will allow, in my view, the drafting of public policies and the implementation of public policies targeted towards the heart of the problem faced by each group of people based on their real circumstances. Well, I want to wrap up because Kasari is going to speak to us, and I believe that the most dynamic part of this conversation stems from the questions to be raised by you, audience listening to us today. I don't know how many of you were able to listen to the podcast called Renegades, which brought together Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen. I loved it. And in the last episode of a series of podcasts, Obama tells Bruce what makes him optimistic and hopeful about the future of a more whole, true, and better nation. He's speaking obviously of the US. And according to Obama, what made him optimistic, what makes him optimistic is the new generation coming up. In Obama words, and I quote here, they believe in a unifying story of America. They believe that people are equal. They do not believe in discriminating based on the color of the skin or sex orientation. They do not believe in a society that ignores the desecration of our planet. End of quote. Well, the question is for them and for us here in British Columbia and Canada, can we hold this thing together long enough and hand it over to them, the new generation? And Obama concluded that our job is to create that bridge to the younger generation. So when I finalize my brief introduction, I just want to emphasize my perspective that I see the second and third generation of Latin Americans living here in BC under the same perspective as Obama did. I believe that our youth incorporate the best values that they bring from Latin America, and they bring from Latin America coming from their experience visiting their relatives back there in their countries, in their home countries, or the countries of origins of their parents, or through the day-to-day learning in their homes with their parents and relatives here in BC. And at the same time, they incorporate the best values that they see here in Canada, in British Columbia. In a world marked by the outrageous growth of the ultra-nationalist extreme right, it is comforting to realize that here in BC and in Canada, identity works differently and in a way serves as an antidote to the flourishing of racism and radical populism. I see this event as an opportunity for a reflection and dialogue on the importance of transforming the multiple identities, and human diversity represented in Latin American community into a unique richness of British Columbia and ultimately of Canada. This is my hope. And with these final words, I give back the floor to Lily, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you.
Thank you so much, Silvio. This is fascinating. We already have a few questions to share, but I will hold them for the end of the presentation so we can share them both with Kasari and Silvio. Kasari, please join me on stage now. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Silvio. Thank you to the Vancouver Latin American Cultural Center Society and the Vancouver Public Library for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you and so many joining in this forum as well as on Facebook Live. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that I am here on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in what's now known as East Vancouver. As a descendant of migrants and settlers, I am incredibly grateful to the Coast Salish peoples who have cared for this beautiful land that we are in and these beautiful waters for so many generations. It's an honor to be here with all of you and to be talking about many of the topics that Silvio has laid the groundwork for us today. In the description of the panel, the organizers have asked how racialized labels affect our sense of self, of belonging, and whether these classifications can lead to racism or help in the fight against it. I do not have Latin American roots, so these labels do not speak directly to my own sense of belonging. Instead, my role here, as you've heard, as BC's Human Rights Commissioner, and my task today is to talk about the role of these classifications in addressing systemic racism in our laws, policies, and practices. However, I do also speak from a place of personal experience in the application of racialized labels, other racialized labels, as a mixed race person and as the descendant of South African Indians. My father grew up under apartheid South Africa. These labels have played an interesting role in my own identity and my own sense of belonging, and none of that is simple. To me, despite the complexities, there is no question that race-based data and the categories that this data is based on play an important role in supporting effective human rights work. In my view, an important way to guard against inequality and injustice is to ensure that our decisions are rooted in the evidence. And by evidence, I mean evidence that derives both from statistics, but also from lived experience. So before delving more into the role of my office, BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, I'll call it BCOHRC for short, and before talking about our work on race-based data, the grandmother perspective that Silvio mentioned, I want to spend some time talking about the state of human rights during the pandemic, to kind of lay the groundwork. What are we talking about here? What data do we have? What do we know about human rights in our communities based on categories like race, but also gender and disability? And I really appreciate, Silvio, your flagging of the concept of intersectionality, which is so essential to understanding how data can work effectively. COVID-19 has amplified racial tensions and fueled hatred, extremism, and the rise of authoritarianism. The virus is exacerbating poverty, homelessness, hunger, mental illness, and domestic abuse. While we don't have the data in BC to make these findings, in Ontario, we know that COVID has disproportionately impacted Latin American people. In fact, recent stats from Toronto show that Latin Americans in that city are 7 times more likely than white people in that city to contract the virus. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has spread hate along with the virus. We have witnessed an increase in violent acts rooted in ignorance and discrimination against marginalized communities, particularly Asian Canadian and Indigenous communities. Police forces are noting dramatic increases in hate. The Vancouver Police Department recorded a nearly 900% increase in reported incidences of hate over the first 9 months of the pandemic. And that's, of course, just the incidences that were reported to police. We know that many marginalized communities don't feel safe reporting in that environment, and the numbers are likely much higher than that. The acceleration that we've witnessed over the past year or so builds on the rise of hate in BC pre-COVID. Hate crimes rose 55% in BC from between 2015 and 2017. We know as well that the rise of discrimination and widening inequalities during this time is not only on the basis of race and indigeneity. For example, people with disabilities have faced a rise in harassment, particularly around mandatory masking policies. We know that people with disabilities have been distanced from their healthcare providers and their service care providers, upon which they may rely for essential daily care. The impacts of gender equality have also been stark. Anti-violence services in Vancouver reported a 300% increase in demands just weeks into the pandemic. And family violence has risen sharply over this time as women and young people find themselves in isolation with abusers. Unemployment has also spiked, and data shows that young people and women, particularly women of color, are bearing the brunt. At least 1.5 million Canadian women lost their jobs in the first 2 months of the pandemic in what analysts have called a she-cession rather than a recession. By April 2020, just as the pandemic began its wildfire spread, women's participation in the workforce fell by 55%, according to one RBC Bank report. That's a low not seen since 1986. In the same time period, another study conducted by the Association for Canadian Studies found that Black, Latin American, and South Asian Canadians were the most likely to have lost income or struggled to make ends meet because of the pandemic. Of course, in BC, especially in BC, this crisis is playing out against the already grim backdrop of our worsening opioid overdose emergency. But there is more to this moment in time than the health crises we face. From the Black Lives Matter protests to the Wet'suwet'en solidarity protests, people across the continent, across continents, have been rising up against racism and colonization, sparking important conversations about how systemic racism shows up in our laws, in our institutions, in our policing, for example. It's an important time to be birthing a new Human Rights Commission, which is what we've been doing, and thinking creatively about the role that this office can play in tackling systemic racism. So while we find ourselves in crisis, I think we also find ourselves in this unique moment for change. Silvio ended his comments on a sort of note of hope. And I think that the calls to address sexism, racism, and ableism in our institutions have become louder as we've gone through these unprecedented shifts. But to do that work, I think we need data and evidence. The more information we have about structural inequality, the better we can seek to address it. So I talked about this task that my office has been working on, establishing this new Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. I was appointed in September 2019, just months before the virus breakout. So human rights responses to the pandemic have been central to our work almost since our inception. The core of our work is providing oversight to the implementation and fulfillment of the Human Rights Code. So that's a legislative tool where the focus is on discrimination in the context of employment, services available to the public, and housing. We are also focused on decolonization, addressing the rise of hate and white supremacy, treating poverty as both a cause and effect of inequality, and protecting the rights of those detained by the state, either in the criminal justice system or in the mental health system. While we've been busy over the last year building the organization, one of our proudest accomplishments to date is one that I hope will make a significant contribution to uprooting systemic discrimination long term. In early September of last year, my office published a report that shares our findings on how to ensure disaggregated data is collected and used in service of and significantly in collaboration with those who are systemically discriminated against. The report is called Disaggregated Demographic Data Collection in BC, the Grandmother Perspective. Disaggregated data, you've heard that term a few times today. It's basically the information that provides subcategories of information. So it breaks down data by ethnicity, for example, by gender, by occupation, and so on. Unlike aggregate data, which groups information together, disaggregated data parses out information in a way that can reveal inequalities and some of the relationships between categories that are disaggregated. This is important because when policy, practice, and law are predicated on statistics, silences and omissions in those statistics can cost human lives, human rights, and human wellness. On the other hand, data that reveals the impacts of sexism, of racism, of other forms of discrimination can act as a tipping point for policymakers and decision makers to take action. So for example, I already talked about the data that shows us that women are overrepresented in unemployment numbers during the pandemic. And knowing that kind of data can allow for policy solutions to be better tailored to the problem. So for example, it can allow advocates then to use that data to push for better childcare strategies in response to unemployment, which might target exactly those who are most likely to be unemployed. Another example of disaggregated data done well comes from LA County in the US. The county used disaggregated data on COVID-19 rates to expand culturally competent COVID-19 testing, treatment, and prevention strategies aimed at a number of populations, in particular Latin American populations. Closer to home, and I should say they saw rates go down as a result of those targeted strategies. Closer to home, COVID-19 data based on postal code has led to the conclusion that South Asian Canadians have seen huge spikes in infection rates. I mentioned that we don't have race-based disaggregated data here in BC on COVID, but we have been able to see some of that through postal code mapping. So when healthcare providers within those communities organized to provide culturally appropriate and language appropriate messaging and health advice, those rates drop dramatically. So we can see the direct impact of collecting this kind of information. But it's also really important to recognize that collecting and using disaggregated data is not without its risks. And we must ensure that we do so responsibly so that we don't end up reinforcing problematic biases. As a starting point, we need to be clear that the project of collecting disaggregated data is about unpacking the impacts of racism or measuring the impacts of racism rather than measuring race itself. In writing about the grandmother perspective, we caution that data must only be collected to advance social change, much as a grandmother or matriarch might use her knowledge of her family to better care for them. And we were gifted that perspective from a woman named Gwen Phillips, who is a First Nations data champion here in BC. And she talked about how important it is to collect data from this caregiving kind of perspective. Our report is grounded in conversations we had with communities and experts, during which we heard loud and clear that colorblind approaches to public policy only worsen outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because we can't address what we can't see, or we won't address what we don't see. We also heard about the real risks we face when we collect disaggregated data, and we're cautioned against repeating the mistakes of history. For example, Japanese internment here in BC, apartheid in South Africa. These were racist regimes and actually residential schools in the Indian Act here in Canada. These racist regimes were enabled through the collection of race-based data. So clear dangers there. And short of those extremes, increased stigma is a real risk of race-based disaggregated data. So our research used a human rights-based approach to arrive at the conclusion that communities must have some real control over their own data to limit the chances of it being used to perpetuate these kinds of racist divisions or this kind of stigma. Our key recommendation is the establishment of a legislative structure, so a new law that would support the collection of disaggregated data in service of systemic equality with the meaningful involvement of marginalized communities. And we laid out some detailed recommendations on how to do that, for example, through the appointment of a community advisory board. And I'm pleased to report that those recommendations are being adopted and developed by the provincial government right now. The resolution of individual legal issues or resolution of individual human rights issues is one important part of the human rights puzzle. Addressing the structure underlying rights violations, working to combat closely held stereotypes or biases, dismantling the legal structures that perpetuate colonial practices. These are another important piece of the puzzle. And in order to address these kinds of structural issues and create structural change, again, I want to return to the fact that we need to root these policies and practices in lived experiences reflected in data, and including and in particular data related to those most marginalized among us. So thank you for listening to my comments. I'm looking forward to the questions and the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasari. Such interesting work you do and such important work. Silvio, can you please join us on stage? We have some questions for you. So we have a few questions, and I'm going to try to relay them in the order they came. So I'm not sure that we're going to be able to go through all of them. And I also try, as they are not being addressed to Kasari or Silvio, I'll try to figure this out. I think a few of them came during Silvio's presentation, so that go for this. Silvio, on your note about women, we have a question from Sonia. She's saying, I would also highlight intra-community social cultural patriarchy, machismo, which is an existing barrier limiting women's leadership, though we are definitely challenging it. So it's not exactly a direct question, but an interesting comment. And so I thought that you might want to pitch in.
Well, yes, I see it as a comment, not a question. But I just want to point out that we have to be very honest when we speak about some characteristics that we bring with us from Latin America. And it's superficial, and it's a general perception that I bring to you now. But it's unavoidable to refer to the fact that we have a very machista cultural background in Latin America. So in a way, arriving in a society where I would say equity is more present in the relationship between sexual identities, it is for some Latin Americans a shock, but for many of us, it is something that enlightens our perspective of relationships between men and women, and in this sense, that I believe that it's a very interesting chemistry, mixing a perspective that we bring from Latin America and in a very different culture that in relationship with this rapport between men and women and the people from different sexual identities here in Canada. So we have a lot to learn from their experience, and we certainly have a lot to teach them about how people in Latin America have been trying to overcome our barriers in this area.
I think there is this other question is a little bit like a follow-up question. And it says, Can you please speak to the generalization of all Latinx people fit under the category BIPOC? When you talk about being racialized, is it possible to have that experience when you have white skin, regardless if you are Latinx? Thank you. I would like to add to this question. I answered the census just this past week, and there are questions about ethnicity. It always is a moment for me when I mark white and Latin American, and one thing that I say to almost everybody I encounter is that we have an opportunity of being Latin Americans because we are not in Latin America, because we are in Canada, we are exposed to each other, and so this feeling, like when for the first time I marked Latin American in the census here, it was a little bit of a moment. But this thing of lumping people together, any comments about that, Silvio?
Yeah, it's important to bring to everybody's attention that here in Canada, they not only use the expression visible minority, they also use the expression invisible minority. So do not commit the mistake of believing that because you have white skin, you're not seen as a minority here in Canada. Either your family name or other characteristic linking you to Latin America, we're speaking here of Latin American identity, will point out to the fact that you are a minority. So either being an invisible minority or a visible minority, you're still Latin American, and you in these two classifications, you unavoidably bring to yourself this weight of what I see as an imperfect way of defining and classifying people that unfortunately is still used officially in Canada, despite the criticism coming up from the UN. But white Latin Americans are seen, yes, they are seen as a minority, but they are seen as an invisible minority because of the color of their skin. And this does not prevent them from being discriminated against. This is something that I want to point out. Being white and Latin American does not preventing you from being labeled and being discriminated against.
Kasari, would you like to pitch in on this one as well? Because it's just, it affects other communities as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear sort of two pieces from this question. One is the use of the term BIPOC in terms of how it lumps people together. And I feel like I've been privy to a lot of interesting conversations recently about that term. My personal feeling is that it's more about the way it's used, that sometimes there are ways in which it's a short form for those who experience racism. And so if that's the way it's being used, I think it can be quite helpful. The ways in which racism are experienced or colonialism are experienced are very different in those different groups. And not just between Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but obviously there are many, many ways in which the racism is experienced. So to me, it's more about the use of the term, but I think we're going to start to see it going out of use because there has been a lot of critique of the way that it lumps people together and perhaps perpetuates this idea that all people who experience racism experience it in the same way. On the second part, I think, of the question, which is sort of that issue of how much our skin color directly correlates to the experience, racism experience. I think for some people that is very true, that there is a connection between melanin and the treatment people receive. But I don't think it's a simple question. I mean, as for my own experience as a mixed race person being raised by somebody who experienced extreme racism, I think that's always a question that I've really grappled with. And I can imagine that I share this experience maybe with some folks in the audience, that unless you are very clearly identifiable, people will often identify you in all different ways, and you have no idea how somebody perceives you. I know from my experience, I have been spoken to in most languages in the world, and people think I can understand them. People, and I love that. That's a good part of the experience. But the bad part is I have no idea when people perceive me to be one of them or not. It's really in the eye of the beholder. So I'm a bit wary of entirely marking our understanding of racism based on skin color. But that is a very important part of the experience. But part of it is the experience of your family, the experience of the perceptions of those outside of you. And it can't all be measured by melanin.
Yeah, we have several questions on the use of the term, of some terms. And so this is really, we're talking about labels in this conversation. And I'm glad to see that people are really tuning into that. So another one is the use of the word Latinx, and which I still feel conflicted about. Like for this event, we decided to use, to keep the term Latinx for a youth panel that we're going to have next Wednesday, because it has, to me, it had a feeling, I have a feeling that is like a new term, and that it feels that people feel more represented when using it. But at the same time, it's something that, because when we have the genders in Spanish and Portuguese, and we would say the Latino or Latina, and so when you put the X, you are not using you are not identifying by gender. I wonder if Silvio has any comments on the term Latinx.
Well, I see it as a human tendency to classify people and the weight of racism came, we cannot forget about it, with the tendency, the ideological and political tendency of Europeans to classify and label people during colonialism and slavery. It was very important to make it clear the distinction between, and the hierarchy between people of, and it was very easy to do so with different color of skins. But I tend to see any attempt to label groups of people as a valid attempt. In this case, I don't see it heavily contaminated by a sense of being an expression built up to exclude, but it's an attempt to include people in this human attempt to classify and label humankind. So I'm very cautious about all kinds of labels. I bring it to, I heard it in my house through my son, who is 19 years old. He brought it from his school in Quetzilano, but again, I resist a little bit in the acceptance of all labels, although I recognize that it's a common behavior of mankind. So I understand it as acceptable. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I'm seeing quite a bit of that on the questions, because there are so many terms. We have Latino, Latin American, Hispanic, Latinx, and so and I think it's in a way, it could be a reflection of us being lumped together again, because Latin America is not like a monolith. We have all these different regions, and so you start having specific words to tie in to different groups, or to satisfy different groups, when it's just so hard to label. So a question for Kasari about this: do you think labels are helpful, or are they harmful?
Well, I think they can, I think they're both. I think that's the sort of basis of the data collection work that we've been doing. I think labels are a necessary part of doing this work. Without the labels, we can't measure, unless we define a category, we can't measure that category. So I think, I was just reflecting on my answer to the previous question, my kind of ramblings about those issues. And I think what it points to in this question as well is the way in which privilege and oppression intersect and overlap. And they're not as simple as the labels might have them make them sound. Intersectionality is a key way to move away from the boxes of labels. It makes the boxes overlap. So again, intersectionality being the idea that we have multiple identities that intersect, and that means we have multiple ways in which we are privileged and oppressed all in one human body and one human experience. So I think that's the way that we can counter some of the harm of labels. But I think labels are necessary in order to move the work forward, however limiting they are.
Yeah, definitely excellent. And this is just a really useful to start thinking about this. I think that it's the main reason we wanted to do this series of events. And I think that this is a conversation we are starting today that I just don't want it to end, because it's just such a rich subject, and that help us start, finding our own identity as Latin Americans, and how we can be invested of it in a positive way, and how we can reflect this into Canadian society and in our lives. Just taking another look here at so many. Okay, I'll get the most recent one here, because it says, to what extent is the fear of the great replacement in BC understood? That whites are losing out to other groups in terms of rights and privileges. I understand that in the US, and specifically the insurrection on the Capitol in January 6th, the one quality that those who participated share is not a membership in any radical groups, but fear of the great replacement. So is that something, and that's a question for Kasari, and Silvio is more than welcome to pitch into, is that something that we identify in Canada, Kasari?
I'm so sorry, you cut out a little bit there, Lily. Can you repeat the question for me?
The question is about the great replacement, which is, the fear in the US that the whites are losing out to other groups in terms of rights and privileges. Is that something that that you identify in Canada as well, and how does that manifests here?
Yes, I think we are unfortunately not immune to many of the forces that we see south of the border and elsewhere in the world, and the rise of white supremacy and violence surrounding racism and authoritarianism. And much of that, I think, is rooted in fear, which is, it's been interesting. I say interesting with quotes. I mean, it's devastating, but also a phenomenon to pay attention to. And the rise of domestic violence during the pandemic, and the rise of gender-based violence, and the rise of race-based violence and hate, which I think is rooted in this time of deep insecurity. With the pandemic, the world turned upside down in so many ways, and the ways in which that uproots power, which I think for those who hold power can be deeply instabilizing and can result in this kind of violence. And I don't mean that from an individualistic perspective. I mean, I think it uproots systems of power, and that leads to the kind of fear that we see erupting into systemic racism and other forces like that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. We are reaching the end of our event. I just want to promise you all that we are going to create more spaces for conversation about this subject, and that we appreciate immensely your participation and questions. Silvio and Kasari, thank you so much for being here, for donating your time, and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. We are going to leave the stage now and hand it back to Jorge so he can go for the closing remarks. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Silvio, Kasari, for being here today, like Lily said. And thank you so much, Lily, for facilitating and for this wonderful partnership. This started off as a wonderful series. So thank you again. And thank you, everyone, who joined us today on your lunch breaks. Thank you to my colleague Jen, who's in the background helping run this smoothly and answering all the questions. Thanks everyone for your participation. It's always wonderful to do an event and see all your interest and your engagement. And we promise to keep doing events like this. So if you want to watch this event again, or if you want to share it with your friends who weren't able to attend, just remember that it was live streamed to VLACC's page on Facebook. So you can find it right there, right now actually. If you click on it right now, you'll see the event immediately. VLACC's also going to put it on their YouTube in a few days, and it'll be captioned on YouTube. We would also really like if you gave us feedback about this event. So we're going to share a survey that VLACC put together. It'll take you about 2 minutes to complete the survey, so just click on that. It'll be really useful for us to get a sense of how this experience was for you. And on that note, I'm just going to remind you that the next event of this series is happening tomorrow at the same time, so also a lunchtime conversation. And it'll be an exploration on migration and diaspora with the famous actor and author Carmen Aguirre, and with Nuno Porto, who is a curator at the Museum of Anthropology. So they're going to share a conversation using some objects from the museum on how diaspora and migration and movement of people shapes our identity. So check it out on the website that we're going to share right now in the chat again, so you can see the details. And yeah, if you want to see more programming that VLACC does and you want to stay in the loop of all of their activities year-round, I really suggest that you sign up for their wonderful newsletter. So we're going to share a link to that too, so you can stay in tune with or in touch with VLACC and everything they put together. I saw in the comments someone was sharing that VLACC hosts a choir, so I know there's a lot of interest in choirs here as well. So please join their newsletter. On that note, thank you all for coming. I'm going to leave. I'm going to do the awkward wave and disappear. But what we're going to do is we're going to keep this open for a few minutes just because we shared so many links that we want to make sure that you can click on them and keep them open on tabs on your browser. So it'll be open for about 5 minutes once I leave. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.